the happy couple soon produced a boy, none other than Robert the Bruce, the future King of Scotland. The point is that in the Middle Ages, it was entirely credible for a powerful young woman to kidnap a man. Marjorie was by no means an isolated example. The Victorian idea that women are somehow less sexual than men would have struck your medieval punter as, well, just plain daft. If you want to know how people liked to imagine themselves, or how they wanted other people to see them, a good way is to look at the kind of entertainment they enjoyed. And in the Middle Ages, that meant listening to stories. Reading was a communal activity. The lady of the household would sit in her private apartments with her damsels, and they'd take it in turns to read aloud to each other. And sometimes the stories could be surprisingly sexy. They certainly didn't expect their heroines to be shy and retiring. Try this from the 14th century fantasy Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Story so far. Gawain's on a quest, and he sleeps the night in a strange castle. He's woken up very early in the morning when the lady of the castle comes into his room, locks the door, tiptoes across to his bed, and sits down on it. And she says, "My lord and his men are a long way off. The other men are still in their beds, and my ladies also. The door is closed and fastened with a strong lock. You are welcome to my body, your pleasure to take. I am driven by forces beyond my control to be your servant, and so I shall." Mills and Boone, eat your heart out, huh? Prudery in medieval England was not a virtue. For example, if a husband failed to perform in the marriage bed, his wife was perfectly at liberty to go public. One 12th century manual advocates the physical examination of the man's genitals by wise matrons, who presumably knew how these things worked. Witnesses were then to be summoned to observe a full-blown road test of the underperforming member. Poor old Walter de Font was a citizen of Canterbury. In 1292, his wife complained that he was impotent. So he was duly examined by 12 worthy women of good reputation and honest life, who testified that his virile member was, quotes, useless. What a way to enter history. In a similar case involving a character by the name of John, one of the witnesses seems to have got rather carried away. According to the court report, one conscientious matron was so anxious to fulfill her civic duty that she exposed her naked breasts, and with her hands warmed at the said fire, she held the member of the said John, and she embraced and frequently kissed the said John. Well, you can't get that on the NHS. The medieval church had long struggled with the problem of sexuality. It's not that there was anything wrong with sex, of course. After all, God had said, "Go forth and multiply." It's just the tendency for people to enjoy it was the problem. It's not surprising that the monkish writers saw woman and her remorseless sexual appetite as the root of all evil. The wickedness of women is greater than all the other wickedness of the world. The poison of asps and dragons is less dangerous to men than the familiarity of women. The image of God is in man. Woman is not made in God's image. Women, of course, were still carrying the can for the sins of Eve, for which they'd been under attack long before the Middle Ages. Do you not know that you are Eve? You are the devil's gateway. At the same time as the church castigated women for being the daughters of Eve, it also promoted an ideal of chaste womanhood that did not lure men to sin. Of course, it wasn't an easy ideal to achieve, since it involved becoming a mother while at the same time remaining a virgin. Bit of a tricky one. But then the church was hardly living in the real world when it came to women's roles. The reality was that women often took on exactly the same work as men, in addition to having children and running the home. Take Margaret Paston, for example, who lived in and around Norwich in the 15th century. That's one of the family homes down there. Well, there must have been times when Margaret found her role as a country housewife rather more eventful than anyone could have imagined. The family's showpiece was Caister Castle in Norfolk. It was one of the earliest all-brick properties in England, with 40 bedrooms, 2 halls, a chapel, kitchen, larder, cellar, buttery, pantry, armoury, brewery, bakery and stables. And Margaret ran the whole show. But over and above all this, Margaret was even expected to fill her husband's shoes as a warrior when the need arose. The Pastons were a family on the make, who had acquired a lot of land in Norfolk very quickly, and acquired a lot of enemies into the bargain. Margaret's husband John was a sharp lawyer who spent most of his time in London, leaving his wife at home in Norfolk. Sad for them, but lucky for us, because it meant the loving couple kept writing to each other. And by a small miracle, a lot of their letters have survived. And these tell us that while her husband was away defending the family interests in court, Margaret was back home in Norfolk, defending the estates in a rather more dramatic way. In 1448, a certain Lord Moleyns claimed that the house she was currently living in belonged to him, and he threatened to attack her with a small army. Margaret sent to her husband a request for certain domestic supplies. Right worshipful husband, I pray you to get some crossbows and handles to wind them with, and arrows, and also 2 or 3 short poleaxes. I pray that you also have brought for me 1 pound of almonds and 1 pound of sugar, and some broadcloth for a hood for me. Eventually, Lord Moleyns sent in 1,000 armed men with battering rams and pans of fire. They dug mines under the building, and the wall of the chamber where Margaret was sitting collapsed. She was carried off, presumably complete with crossbows, poleaxes, almonds and sugar. As the Middle Ages progresses, women's improving status can be seen reflected in what they wore. But although medieval women began to take on men's roles, the more equality they acquired, the more they dressed to emphasize their femininity. Medieval clothing expert Sarah Thursfield showed me some of the latest styles with the help of the borough players at Gainsborough Old Hall, Lincolnshire.
Everybody has a mental picture of the medieval lady with the traffic cone on her head.
Yeah.
And as far as we can tell, English women never actually wore traffic cones on their heads. You get the shorter version, not the long-pointed Burgundian fantasy.
In the 14th century, you've got more elaborate, more splendid costumes for both men and women.
Possibly not more splendid, but a shift is from loose layers of nice fabric to things which really fit the body very closely. The gown is a generic term for what both men and women wear on the outside.
Yeah.
And this is about as grand as it gets, because this is velvet. She's a lady, her husband's big with the court, they can afford velvet. Most of us can't.
So what sort of social standing would you be?
I'm a respectable sort of lower middle class widow.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm not nearly as fitted as Dawn.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to pull everything in. Lady Borough, she's dressed for dinner, she's dressed for ceremony, so it's a matter of impressing everyone when she comes to the hall, looking her part, looking her status.
14th century seems to be actually one of the best times for women.
Oh yes, yes.
Within 100 years of the conquest, noble ladies had moved from wearing simple gowns to elaborate embroidery and even more elaborate hairstyles. And as trade increased, making a greater variety of coloured cloths available, women began making strong statements about who they were by what they wore. By the middle of the 14th century, women had become more empowered, thanks, ironically, to a social catastrophe. The Black